Hey, Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Tom. I'm really excited to be here.
Absolutely, it's a pleasure to have you. So if you haven't met Matt yet, Matt Abrahams is the author of Speaking Up Without Freaking Out. He teaches both strategic communication and effective communication at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. Matt is also the co-founder and principal at Bold Echo Communication Solutions, a presentation and communication skills company based in Silicon Valley that helps people improve their presentation skills. Matt, it's great to have you.
Thanks.
Yeah, so tell us about kind of your background, Matt, and why you got so interested in public speaking and presentation skills.
Sure, certainly. So I have been doing this work for a long, long time, and I can trace my interest in this back to being a freshman in high school. So when I was in freshman English, I had a teacher, Mr. Meredith. He was a bit older, and everybody in the first week of class had to get up and say who they were and what they did. And I did that, and at the end of the day, he came up to me and said, "You're pretty good at that talking thing. You should go to this tournament that's coming up in a weekend or two." So being a naive freshman, I showed up, and I gave a presentation, and unfortunately, things didn't go as well as I had planned. My presentation was on karate, and I was prepared to start with a big karate kick, and I did. But because I was so nervous about this presentation, I had forgotten to put on my very special karate pants, which had a little extra room in them. And in the beginning of my 10-minute speech, within the first 10 seconds, I ripped my pants front. And at that moment, I was horrified. I was beyond myself in fear. Somehow I mustered the courage to get through that. And ever since that day, I've been fascinated with what makes for confidence, what helps people get through difficult communication situations. And so when I went to college, I looked into studying psychology, and then I actually got a graduate degree in communication. And ever since then, I've been teaching communication and coaching people to help them be more confident and compelling when they communicate. So don't let anybody ever tell you, Tom, that something that happens early in your life can't have a major effect on your career, because that certainly affected mine.
That's awesome. That's such a hilarious story. I can just imagine your pants ripping completely doing a karate kick.
Well, let's say it's hilarious in retrospect. At the time, it was not fun.
Yeah, I can definitely imagine. So was that like a traumatizing experience for you? I mean, were you the kind of person who like afterwards just like, I'm speaking again?
Yeah, so it was a very challenging experience. But what it helped me do in the immediate time after, I really focused better on communication. So I actually, believe it or not, in that speech tournament, did really, really well. And I attribute my success in that tournament to the fact that I had totally deviated from my plan and needed to be really focused and just mustered up all my courage, and that helped me be more compelling. So that made it even more intriguing for me. So it didn't stop me from speaking. It definitely helped me to be better prepared when I speak. But it really kindled an interest in me about what makes people confident, how can we harness confidence and actually anxiety as well to help us in our communication.
That's great. So let's talk a little bit about like anxiety, because I know like every time I do a presentation or a speech, even interviews like this, I get a little anxious, a little nervous. And I've been doing this for, I've been a public speaker for like 10 years now. And I love it. It's like my passion. Like I could speak every day. I love doing it. At the same time, though, it's very emotionally challenging. And still 10 years later, do you have any tips for people to overcome that, those emotions around it?
So you're absolutely right that anxiety around communicating it's very emotional, and it brings up a whole bunch of issues in terms of how we see ourselves and relate to other people. And there are many techniques people can use to manage their anxiety. And I use that term manage very particularly. I don't think people would ever really want to overcome their anxiety. As in my personal case, you can actually harness anxiety to give you focus, to give you energy, but you want to manage it so it doesn't manage you. And there are lots of different, in the book I wrote, I cover over 50 techniques that come from academic literature that people can use. Not all 50 will work for everybody. I'm happy if people can find 3 to 5 of the techniques. But I'll share a few with you. So for example, deep breathing is probably one of the most classic and most tested anxiety management tool. When we get nervous, our fight or flight response activates. Taking deep breaths can help us calm down. It slows down our autonomic nervous response and prepares us to actually be present and to support our speaking through our breath. So that's a technique. Another technique that works really well is when you begin anxiety, instead of get nervous because you're beginning to feel nervous, and a lot of us get swept away in that, use a technique that comes from mindfulness, and that is to greet your anxiety. Say, this is me feeling nervous. It makes sense that I'm nervous. I'm about to do something that's important, that's significant, and in so greeting that anxiety, two things happen. The first is that you short circuit that spiraling out of control, and the second thing that happens is it gives you a little bit of space where you can actually make a decision. You can say, I'm going to take a deep breath, or I'm going to walk around the block. You're not just carried away by that anxiety. So those are two very quick techniques that people can use, and they really do help.
That's awesome. So deep breathing, I mean, I've studied a lot on breathing exercises and meditation that can certainly help a lot. And then the other one is like greeting your anxiety. So I guess for you, that's kind of like just noticing that you're like saying like, okay, I'm feeling anxious, and so what can I do about this? How can I, use this to my advantage, basically?
Right, or how can I pause this reaction that feels like it's just going to take me away, and how can I have a sense of agency in that moment and do something about it? And a lot of people feel just completely out of control, that their anxiety is getting the best of them, when in fact, there are some things you can do to actually give yourself some control and then be able to use that energy in a positive way.
Absolutely. So, one thing I've noticed, Matt, I'm curious if you noticed this as well, is that, for some presentations, like when I switch to like game mode and like the anxious mode, sometimes it's like 5 minutes before, sometimes it's like a day before or like a week before, like a really big presentation. Why does that happen? Like, cause it's tough to be anxious like a week before an event, because then you're spending like a week anxious when, and not being nearly as productive as you could be, essentially. So do you have any tips for kind of like shortening that time period?
Sure. So it really comes down to understanding what's causing the anxiety and then addressing it at the source. So for some of us, for example, if we know we have a really big presentation coming, and what makes it big is the consequence of what we're trying to do. So for example, I work with lots of entrepreneurs out here in Silicon Valley, and they want to get funding or advice or guidance from others. And if they don't get it, their company, their idea go bust. So the stakes are really high. And what's making them nervous is the fear of those future consequences. For other people, what's making them really nervous is who's in the room. If it's your boss or if it's somebody you're trying to impress, that can make you really nervous. And by fundamentally getting to what's causing the anxiety, what's making you nervous, you can then address it so that you, one, don't have that experience taking place over a long period of time, and two, you can actually mitigate it so that energy that goes into being nervous can be used for something productive, like preparing or practicing.
That's a great point. Absolutely. So really identifying exactly, what's making you anxious. That's a great point. So, when I'm nervous, like a week away from something, it's usually, like you said, because it's the consequences, like it's a big presentation, either there's a lot of money or like respect or a lot of people in the audience, something like that on the line. So the stakes are high. So therefore I'm thinking about it farther away than, say, just an impromptu speech or something like at a local event.
That's correct. That's correct. That's exactly what's going on there.
Yeah, that's a great point. So really identifying what's making you anxious, so you can actually focus on, okay, what, like you said, that greeting exercise. Okay, now I know that I'm anxious. Now I identified what's making me anxious. Now I can actually, do this action or prepare more, or take this step to really improve the situation, rather than just focusing on all the thoughts in your mind, essentially.
Correct.
Yeah, awesome. That's great information. So I know another area of kind of anxiety or stress about presentations is like the actual preparation for the presentation, right? Because especially if it's like the first time you're speaking in public, or the first time you're giving a presentation, it can be one of the most stressful speaking situations, right? So what are some great tips you have on actually being a better prepared presenter?
Thanks for asking that question, because a lot of people don't spend the time they need to in preparing. And when they do, they actually prepare in an inefficient way. So I'll give you the top tips I have for preparation. From the get-go, the very first place you need to start is by thinking about who are you speaking to, and really what are their needs. Your audience is taking time to pay attention to you, to listen, to get something from you. And it's your job as a communicator to really figure out what it is they need. Most of us start from the approach of what do I want to say? And I think that's exactly the wrong place to start from. Rather, you should start, does my audience need to hear? And those sound similar, but they're fundamentally different. If you're there in service of your audience, you're going to focus your message on their needs based on their knowledge, their attitudes, their expectations. So that's where you start. The next step then is to figure out, how do I take those needs and then craft a message that addresses them? So we need to find a structure that works. So a structure to me is not a PowerPoint slide or some kind of slide with lots of bullet points on it. Rather, it's a narrative, it's a story. It takes people from one place to the next. You have to figure out the best way to do that. Once that's done, then you can actually begin putting practice into it. That is where you actually vocalize what it is you want to say. A lot of people practice by simply looking at a script or looking at slides. That's not practice, that's review. And there's a difference between reviewing and practicing. Practice, you actually have to speak the words. You know, I like to joke that, and it's true, in my mind, I'm amazingly eloquent. It sounds great in my head, but when I open my mouth, it doesn't always come out that way. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, Tom, but it really requires practicing speaking, and that's how you get better.
That's such a great point. Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, like you said, you have to physically say the words in practice in order to be really prepared, because just looking at your slides might be great to remember what your slides are and to review, but when it comes time to actually speak the words, if you haven't really done it before, it's kind of like showing up for a race, like a 5K race, and you haven't really sprinted recently. It's going to be pretty tough.
Well, you might be sprinting 5K races. I'm just happy to plod through them, but you're exactly right. You have to do that preparation so that when you actually get to game day, you're ready to go.
Absolutely. So you talked about, one of the things you said there is like the narrative, creating a narrative, and that's how you structure your presentations. But I also know that you work a lot with like business people, Silicon Valley, startups, entrepreneurs, and having a narrative sounds kind of woo-woo and like creative and like not businessy. So how does that actually apply like in a very strict kind of business environment?
Well, so first I'll say that it's changing. People are getting that story-based presentations are really important, and I attribute this to primarily TED Talks. TED Talks tend to have strong narratives. And as that has become more mainstream, people are seeing the value of it. So it's no longer sort of the memo approach to presenting. It's more the story approach. And that's been an evolution that's been happening over the last several years, and it continues. So I do agree that people sort of get a little frown on their face when you talk about narrative, but it's nowhere as strong a resistance as it used to be. So, sometimes if people are resistant or hesitant to this notion of narrative, I'll use terms like structure. Here in Silicon Valley, people are very used to that notion of structure. Code is structured. If you're coding software, it's very structured. If you are in the medical or scientific profession, structure is really important because you have the process and steps you go through. So people understand that really a good story, a good narrative has structure. It's not rambling. It has a beginning, a middle, and end. It has a logic between what happens. There's change that goes on throughout that time. So you have to find the right analogy or the right terminology, but people get it. People understand that you just can't be free-flowing. There has to be a form to what you're doing.
Gotcha. So how do you actually form like a narrative? Like, can you give us an example of how you actually create a narrative for a presentation?
So it depends on what you're trying to achieve, right? So it's going to be different. But if I'm trying to inform somebody of something, so as I'm doing here, I'm trying to inform you of what a good narrative would be like. There are certain structures that you can leverage. One of my favorite structures is very simple. It's called the what, so what, now what structure. And it leads you through a very logical narrative. I tell you what it is, I then explain why it's valuable, and then I say what you can do with it. And in fact, what I've just done in explaining that structure is I've used it. I defined the structure, I explained what it's used for, the value of it, and then my encouragement to you would be go try. And there are many of them, and these we're familiar with. Past, present, future. Talk about how your product or company worked in the past. Talk about how they work in the present. Talk about how they'll work in the future. So these are, in some cases, intuitive. In some cases, we use them a lot. In other cases, they might be a little arcane. But the reality is there are many, many structures. And structure not only helps your audience understand where you're going and feel comfortable with how you're going to get there, but it helps you as a speaker because structure provides a map so you can remember how you're getting from one place to the other. I like to say you can't get lost if you have a map, and if you have a structure, it's less likely that you'll forget what you're going to say.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. So, I've given a lot of presentations. I never really thought about structure in that way, but it sounds to me like it's almost similar to like the writer's journey, like the 3-act narrative.
Absolutely.
So I'm trying to figure out though, like how do you actually apply this when your words, let's say I have a big presentation and I want to create from scratch. Do you start with that structure and then fill in everything from there?
No, I start with my audience. So the very first thing I do is think about who's my audience, what do they know about what I'm presenting on, what do they feel about it, what are their expectations, what might their questions be, and based on those answers, I think about what is the best structure that will fit an audience of that type. And what it means, especially for people like yourself or like me who give a lot of presentations, it means you have to adjust. You don't just create one presentation once and go give the same presentation to lots of different audiences. Rather, what you need to do is you have a core set of ideas you want to get across. You think about your audience, and then you structure each presentation accordingly to the needs and demands of that audience.
Gotcha. Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. So you're really starting with, you're filling out the structure with your ideas and your content.
The audience is the guide.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. So what are some tips that you can give people who are already presenting and they just want to get better results? So maybe they're already kind of public speaking, they're already, maybe they're doing book signings or speeches or keynote speeches, something like that, but they just want to have a better impact on their audience.
Yeah, so a lot of the work I do is exactly what you're talking about. It's how do you develop and hone the skills of the people that you're working with and talking to. And there are a series of things you can do that ultimately make your presentations more compelling. And to me, it's all about engagement and collaboration. So rather than me just talking to you or at you, I get you involved. So it could be simple as asking some questions of your audience and responding to what they tell you. And that doesn't have to be answers. It could be polling questions. Raise your hand if you've ever done this. It could be asking your audience to imagine something. So rather than telling it to them, paint the picture of where they might go. Imagine what it would be like if you were to. And that kind of language gets people more involved. So there's whole techniques that you can employ that engage your audience more. We remember more and we have a more enjoyable experience when we're part of it rather than watching it. And the analogy I always use, Tom, is a 3D movie. You've probably seen a 3D movie before, and it's much more immersive than just a 2D. Your experience as an audience member is different. You're seeing the same content, but how you get that content and how you experience that content is different. So it's all about being compelling and collaborative with your audience.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. I love incorporating collaboration into my speeches. And something I learned, just after college, I went to like a T. Harv Eker event, like a Peak Potentials seminar, and they're great at giving collaborative presentations. They're always, the first, like as soon as you walk in, they're like, who wants to make more money? And then like, who wants to be happier? And like getting everyone to raise their hands and getting the audience to participate and constantly asking questions, and then, having people stop and do exercises to write things down, and you get the audience involved. And they have actually this advanced course they call Train the Trainer, where they teach you how to become like a really successful presenter. And it's funny because in that course they teach this structure where they essentially they kind of like pull back the curtains on what they do, and they say, hey, now watch me and watch what I'm doing while I'm giving this presentation. Like half the time they're just sitting there not doing anything, they're like drinking tea, because the audience is like so busy talking to each other and answering questions and writing things down. And so it's really like the audience is doing just as much work, if not more work, than the speaker.
Yeah, and the audience is getting more value out of that because they're actually participating, and it's an experience for them rather than just information.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what are some of your favorite tools to get people involved in your presentations?
Yeah, so I've already alluded to them. I love using the word imagine or what if. So I like to start all my presentations by talking about imagine what it would be if you could deliver a compelling presentation without the level of anxiety you normally speak? Or what if you could achieve your communication goals in a confident way? By asking those questions, I think it engages the audience rather than saying, today I'm going to tell you how to become a more confident communicator. You can see that one is much more engaging than the other. So I like using the imagine and the what if. I love getting people to answer questions, be it through polls or actual answers. So those are some of the tricks and tips that I use.
Very cool. So what do you think about PowerPoint? Is PowerPoint still something that you use or recommend?
So I'm not wedded to PowerPoint itself, but the notion of slides, I believe, are very valuable and can really help your audience to understand or to expand on certain comments that you're making, but story comes second. The reality is most people create presentations by creating slides. They don't take the time to understand their audience or understand their structure. So start with your audience, figure out your structure and story, then and only then think, do slides help? Could they assist me in getting my point across? And if the answer is yes, then by all means use them. But if the answer is not yes, then what you need to do is figure out another way to help your audience. So slides are not necessary to give a good presentation, but they can absolutely help.
Gotcha. So slides are something that you bring in the presentation, like kind of well through the planning process, essentially.
They are the last step in the planning process for me.
Gotcha. So how do you plan before that stage? Do you just have pen and paper that you write down notes?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm old enough to remember doing things on pen and paper, but you can also just type things in. You know, I instruct everybody or people I coach to use outlines. It's really helpful because it just cues up what it is you're going to talk about. It shows you where the flow goes. But you can use a storyboard, a mind map, any of that works. But that's where I said, if it makes sense, I will put things into slides.
And so when you're creating these outlines, you're not like planning your speech out word for word, right? You just have kind of generic ideas, the main headings and main principles you want to talk about.
Possible, I strongly encourage people to use just listing of words or slight bullet points to remind them. Out word for word, you invite memorization. And when you memorize, you set yourself up for a lot of pitfalls. First, you typically don't sound authentic reciting something that you've memorized. Second, if you blank out or say something different than what you had memorized, that can cause a great amount of undue stress, and some people can blank out altogether. So it's important to have a flow, to understand the order in which you will go. 2 lines that are critical to say a certain way, and you might commit those to memory. But I much rather have a flow or a diagram or an outline to learn from than to learn word for word.
Gotcha. So earlier we talked about, practicing and the importance of actually speaking when you practice. And so let's say, you've got your outline done, you've done what we've talked about so far, and you're ready to actually practice. How do you do it? Do you just sit in front of the mirror? What's your strategy for that?
I actually, and this is a strategy I recommend to many people, I believe being conversational is really powerful. We respond conversational than more lecture-y or formal. So when I practice a presentation, I actually sit down with some family members or some friends, and so it could be over the dinner table or just having some coffee, and I just talk the presentation through. So my very first practice is always conversational. Then, depending on the venue, I will often get up and try to mimic the venue. So if I know I'm going to be on a big stage, I try to find a place where I could be elevated and see what that's like. If I know it's going to be a smaller room, I just find space and I actually stand up and practice as if I were in the real venue. Sometimes I even digitally record myself so I can watch and see what I'm doing and how I'm using my body and how my voice sounds. But I always start conversationally, then I progress to reflect the actual environment that I'm presenting.
Gotcha. That's a great tip. I love that idea of recording yourself and then watching the tape and seeing what you can learn from it. What are some things that you've learned by watching tapes of people speaking or yourself speaking?
Well, so me personally, I used to speak a lot faster than I do now, and recording myself, both audio and video, helped me improve that. The people I work with notice tons of things, everything from their eyes darting all over the place to swaying side to side. So there's a lot you can see. And in fact, when people watch their digital recordings, I often instruct them that the very first time they watch it, turn the sound down. because you end up actually distracting yourself with your words. We get caught up in what we're saying. So a great way is to record yourself, then watch it once without sound, and you'll notice a whole bunch of things non-verbally that you're doing that you don't notice when you hear your voice.
It's a great tip. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, most of communication, right, is nonverbal communication, especially when you're in person with someone.
That's right. That's right.
Very cool. So let's talk a little bit about your book, Matt. And I know you've had a lot of success with this. Tell us about your journey to becoming an author.
So I'm a reluctant author. I never set out to be an author. My book came as a result of a need that I noticed in my students. I would be teaching classes on communication, and we'd spend a little bit of time on anxiety management. And then we talk about all these other topics, how to make your speeches compelling, how to include evidence, how to do all these different things. And at the end of the term, my students were saying, I really enjoyed the class, I learned a lot, but you know what? I am still so nervous when I speak that I can't employ all those techniques. And I looked around, and there was really no resource that based on academics that helped people manage that anxiety and ultimately grow from being not so confident to being confident as well as compelling. So I wanted to fill that need for my students. And as I developed the book and as I went through the process, it became very clear to me that the book applied way beyond the classroom. It applies in the boardroom, in the PTA room. I mean, it applies everywhere, the family room. So I took the concept, took the book, morphed it a little more to make it less of a textbook and more of a practical book that people can use. And if you see my book, it's actually not very long, and it's kept short and small on purpose so that you can actually find what you need quickly and employ it. So the book is all about using the skills and tools, not learning them.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So is your book really designed for like the beginner in mind, maybe someone who wants to get into public speaking but has never even tried yet?
I believe my book reaches out to all audiences. Certainly somebody who's new, who's been speaking for years, will find lots of tips and tricks to help them continue to hone their skills and then try something different than what they're normally doing. These find value in my book.
Sorry, you cut out there, Matt. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so I think my book is valuable to anybody at any level. A novice to an expert will get lots of value. If somebody's new to speaking, they will have to really, they can use the book as a guide to become proficient. And if you're somebody who's been speaking for years, you'll learn new tricks and perhaps be challenged to try different things than your normal habits.
Awesome, very cool. So Matt, would you like to share any of the marketing strategies or lessons that you learned over your years promoting the book?
I'll share a couple. So first, whenever you communicate about your book, try to have some central themes that you want to make sure people understand that are relevant to your book and engage the audience. So it's really putting into practice what Tom, you and I have just talked about. Have some clear ideas and think about how you would structure them. Second, find niche markets where your book would be very useful. So for example, clearly my book helps students, so targeting places where textbooks are sold is very useful. There are whole communities of people who are looking to become better communicators, so I've definitely tried to connect with them so I can be available as a resource for them. So really finding who leverages or could benefit from what it is you've written is really important. And then find the right modalities. I do a fair amount of these podcasts like I'm doing with you. There are other places where people want to interview or listen to ideas you have and go out and speak and get people to hear what it is you've got to say. That's really, really important.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Well, what about, selling books from the back of the room? Because I know, if you have a paperback book or hardcover book, one of the best ways to sell it is just, as a public speaker, doing keynote speeches, doing seminars, workshops, things like that. So do you have any great tips that people can use if they're planning to speak at a workshop or seminar in order to actually sell more books there?
Yeah, well, first make them available. Let people know up front that they'll be available. And what I do, and it's really just to show, in my case, how useful the book can be, is when people in the audience ask me questions, I'll say, absolutely, that's something that we cover in the book. It's in this chapter, and here's what the book tells you about it. So they're seeing right away that what the content is readily available to them. They don't need me to be an intermediary between them and the content, and that excites them. They're like, oh great, I want to go get a copy so I can address that issue or learn how to do that and other things more. So if you can tie what you're saying to the book and how the book is set up for them, then I think that makes a big difference too.
That's actually a really amazing tip, right? Because when you're doing public speaking and someone asks a question, especially like a specific question about maybe anxiety and speaking, right? Like you don't have time to tell them every single thing that's in the book, right? There's just not enough time because you have usually a very limited time you have as a speaker. So by saying that, not only do you really answer the question well and help sell your book, but you also just provide more value to them because you let them know like, hey, essentially kind of saying like subconsciously, like I can't answer the entire question here because there's not enough time, but the book will answer that thoroughly for you. I think that's a really great strategy and a really great idea.
Great, yeah, no, it does, and it helps. And you know, I wrote my book to help people. So I'm just doing what the whole purpose, I'm just executing in front of them. They have a question, how they can continue to get more information. It's not selling to me, it's helping.
Absolutely. And what about inventory? I know one of the things that I've had issues with, you know, as just starting out as a speaker was, you know, how many books do I need to bring to an event? Do you have any good kind of rules of thumb or ways to kind of figure that out?
You know, it really depends. I try to gauge what the audience is interested in. So for example, if I'm going to a Toastmasters group where people have committed themselves to get better at speaking, there's a high degree of likelihood that a number of people would be interested in buying the book. If I'm presenting at a group, and I'm often brought in for professional groups to speak, where, you know, it's a bunch of lawyers or doctors or dentists, you know, the likelihood that a huge number of them are going to be really interested in my topic enough to actually buy the book is lower. So to me, it's about gauging again, it all comes down to knowing your audience. It really has to do with the expectation. So inventory I bring with me based on how audience is.
Are you still there? You cut out again, Matt.
Oh man, I'm sorry. What part did you lose? Where did you lose me?
Is like pretty much all of it.
Okay, I'll answer the question again. So inventory is tricky. The way I get around that issue is it's based on the interest the audience has in my topic. So if I'm speaking to a Toastmasters group, that's a group of people who've really committed themselves to getting better at communicating, there's a high degree of likelihood that many of the folks might be interested in buying my book. But if I go to a professional group, and I often am brought in to talk to lawyers or doctors or dentists, I can't expect that everybody there is going to want to buy my book, so I'll bring fewer copies. So again, as with most things I've been answering your questions with, it really comes down to knowing your audience and what they need and what they expect.
Absolutely, that's great advice for sure. Very good. So what about, you know, getting booked as a speaker? You know, let's say someone, you know, a lot of our audience, they've got books or they're about to publish a book and they want to begin speaking and right to get their message out, to sell more books and so forth, but they have no idea, you know, where to go to even get booked. How do you kind of begin a career as a public speaker?
It's tough, and I don't really have the answer because I'm not convinced I've done it completely or done it well. I can tell you what I have seen in the authors I've coached and seen in my own life. So one, you've got to make people aware of what you do. So you have to find avenues to hone your craft and hone your message and get some exposure. So volunteering to present at service clubs that exist in your city or your town, talking to your local newspaper and media, having a clear social presence online helps. Affiliating yourselves with particular groups that might have a wider reach can also help. There are speakers bureaus. There are speakers bureaus who target authors or who target people who are new to speaking. You can look at those, but it is hard. It's hard to break into that. You know, a lot of independently owned bookstores are willing to book authors. I've done a number of those. And then what happens, or at least what's happened to the authors I've worked with, and to some extent me as well, is you get known. Somebody sees you and says, oh, that'd be interesting. Could you come talk to my group? Or here's somebody else you should know. So it's that network effect that happens. But the only way, in my experience, the network effect takes place is if you initially get yourself out there and start connecting those nodes.
Right. So that's a great point. So really, it's all about kind of who you know to get booked as a speaker. And so the best way to really do that is to go out into your community and give, free speeches anytime you can to get known. And then those audience members who are there will say, hey, I run a chamber of commerce, come speak to us, or I run this group, come speak to us. And that's kind of how you start to build up your network and just start doing more events and get paid for it.
That's correct. That's correct.
Awesome. Great advice. Well, thank you, Matt. You shared just some amazing information with us today. I really appreciate it. And I'd love to hear more about you and the work that you're doing so people can connect with you.
Great. Thanks. I've had a great time having a conversation with you, Tom. Lots of different ways to get in touch with me. If you're really interested in learning more about the book or learning about specific skills for becoming a more confident and compelling communicator, I curate a website called No Freaking Speaking, nofreakingspeaking.com. There's a lot of information there. If you're interested in actually getting some help or some coaching, my consulting practice that I co-founded is called Bold Echo, BOLDECHO, boldecho.com. And that's where we actually go out and help individuals and corporations with these very skills. So 2 places, nofreakingspeaking.com and boldecho.com.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Matt. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom. Take care.